Great Lit students. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time with another PowerPoint lecture just to talk a little bit about this, the change that we're going to see as we move into 20th century literature. So we move into a period known as modernism, so modern art, modern literature. And it's pretty easy to kind of think about sort of generically what modernism means, right? So if I ask you, this is modern art, what do you picture in your mind? Maybe it's something that doesn't even look like art, or maybe it's something that's not realistic, it's more abstract. Modern movies, modern literature, what does that mean? So some examples, like Pablo Picasso is a fantastic example of modernism, that abstract kind of art that decides that really there are no limits. If I want to paint a weeping woman this way, then that is a weeping woman, and there are things within the art itself that indicate that. Or perhaps like the blocks of Pierre Mondrian, there's a whole series of these paintings that are simply just colored blocks and these very geometric shapes. Vincent van Gogh was an early modernist where there was this sense that representing a scene or representing any sort of concept in art does not have to be realistic. There can be these highly imaginative aspects of it. Eventually, modernism across the 20th century moves into types of protest art, like what we have with Banksy, who is still an active artist. And so there's a really interesting kind of an explosion of what is defined as art. We'll see that in literature as well. We'll see forms and formats of literature that had never been kind of considered literary. We'll see those start to emerge. Another place where we see some interesting modernism is with music. One of the most popular and kind of famous examples of modern music is by a musician named John Cage. The piece is called 433, and that's because it's 4 minutes and 33 seconds long. So let me show that to you. I will not play the entire 433, and you'll see why here in just a minute. Okay, so that's pretty much the entire piece. So for 4 minutes and 33 seconds, he moves his hands around, he switches what hand is doing what, but he doesn't actually play a note. So there's this kind of protest against what we consider music. And in this particular piece for Cage, the absence of sound can still be music. And so this modernism, this movement, which really finds its height in the middle of the 20th century, so like the 1950s, 1960s, there's this sense that things that once were rules or what once applied doesn't really apply anymore. So you can kind of hear the roots of that back in the late 19th century. If you remember Oscar Wilde, his aestheticism movement, this sense that it's art for art's sake. Art doesn't really have a moral, it doesn't teach a lesson, it doesn't have some grander purpose, it just is. He uses the example of the flower. It doesn't bloom because it's trying to teach us something, it just blooms just because. And that art and literature should be the same way. We've already talked a little bit about the fact that while Wilde says he believes that, it's very clear he does have a lesson and a moral and a message in his literature, right? Think about the importance of being earnest and all of the different things he was kind of mocking and making fun of. If we think about what it was that was motivating this change, I think there's some interesting shifts in England at the time. There's the breakdown of a lot of different divisions that had once defined society. So class divisions were breaking down. Literature is not the domain of the upper class anymore. The lower classes have a voice. This is what eventually leads to the Beatles. You know, they're four kids from Liverpool. You know, this blue collar working class area. They are not the elite. They are not Oxford and Cambridge. And so they get to have a voice. That's modernism, this breaking down of the barriers. We see the breaking down too of gender barriers, where women across the 20th century are not only gaining more rights, like the right to vote and the right to go to college, but they're gaining more prominence as artists, as writers, as musicians, as novelists, as poets. We see Catherine Mansfield in her short story Next Week really wrestle with this. So education is also driving this. So by the end of the 20th century, there's nearly universal free public education. Over the course of those 100 years of the 20th century, education changes probably more than, or at least as much as, any other aspect of society. So we begin the 20th century still kind of in this place where only the upper class men are able to achieve a higher education or be in that elite kind of education. By the end of the 20th century, that is completely blown out of the water. Anyone can have access to the highest and most elite education. Doesn't necessarily mean they can pay for it, but there is open education and there is access for everyone. So because there's all this breakdown, there's all this shift in society, everything that used to be accepted, truth about the world, truth about the way society works, there's incredible skepticism about that because this is great change, right? So there's this sense of, well, this is changing and that is changing, so why can't everything change? So these questions drive a lot of the literature of the 20th century. So some things that are changing over the course of the 20th century. We see psychology as a field basically be invented in the 20th century. So things that we recognize as the science of psychology today have their roots in the early 20th century. So there's this growing understanding of the human mind, of human motivation, of the human psyche. And so literature and art is beginning to explore all those little nooks and crannies. We also see incredible shift in religion, movement away from religion, particularly some sort of doubt of what was once accepted is very much part of that. Of course, the rapid change in technology, if we think about the life of an individual in 1900, where nearly everyone was still using horse power, like literal horses, to travel, to what we have at the end of the 20th century. So in 1999, the life of that person in 1900 and the life of a person in 1999 are so vastly different in every single aspect: personal hygiene, health, travel, education, communication, entertainment, music. Think about all the ways that that person in 1999 is living a different life than the person in 1900. That is because of this radical shift in technology. It's easy to see why that the writers of the 20th century are wrestling with some disillusionment. Things are breaking down. Questions are being asked that had never been asked before. And so part of the wrestling that we see in modernism and in modern art has to do with those kinds of questions. And sometimes it's quite dark. One of the important social changes in Great Britain over the course of the 20th century, and this is true in the United States as well, is the change in the status of women. So the late 1800s showed some shifts as far as the fact that married women could own property and they were not property of their husbands. In the early part of the 20th century, we see women, primarily the big change there is the right to vote, both in the US and in England. In England, the women who fight for the right to vote are known as the suffragettes. That's also true here in the States. there's a fantastic movie called Suffragette, which is about the women in England fighting for the right to vote. I highly, highly recommend it. They finally get the right to vote in 1918, so women who are 30 and over have the right to vote then. And then 10 years later in 1928, that goes down to 21 and over. And then by the end of the 20th century, it's females have the exact same right to vote as males. It's interesting that women's education did not become fully equal in England until the 1970s. And Cambridge even kept some of its colleges closed to women until the 1980s. So this is my lifetime. So it's been quite recent that some of these massive changes have been put into place. I want to show you really quickly this video that I have linked here, the death of Emily Davison at Epsom in 1913. So this is at the height of the suffragette movement. These women who are protesting and being arrested and going on hunger strikes, like doing these very dramatic things to try to win the right to vote. Epsom, so the Epsom Derby is an enormous horse race every year. It's kind of like what the Kentucky Derby is here in the United States, is the Epsom Derby in England. And Emily Davison was a suffragette. She wanted women to have the right to vote. And one thing that she wanted to do was to make a scene. And so in the middle of the largest race with the largest crowd at the Epsom Derby at Epsom Downs, she steps out onto the race course and is plowed down by a horse. And in fact, the horse that she jumps in front of was very strategic. The horse that she jumps in front of was the king's horse. So the royal family has bred racehorses for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so she intentionally steps in front of the king's horse. And it's actually caught on video footage because remember, the 20th century, technology's changing. We now have movies, we now have video footage, and it is preserved. So I'll let you take a look at it. It happens pretty quickly. Oh, look, it's not available anymore. So let's look at it. Emily Davison, 1913. Here we go. Very jaunty music. I'm going to fast forward to the actual race itself, which is evidently way down here. Okay. All right. So if you see this little moment here, that is her running out. She's in the crowd here. And as the horses begin to pass, she jumps out into the race course and is bowled over. She does die from her injuries. The music is awful, I apologize. I think that moment in time of Emily Davison stepping out it's powerful for the women's movement, it's powerful for the suffragettes, but I think it's also very indicative of the modern movement, that there are statements being made in ways they've never been made before. There are people who are desperate to be heard, that are desperate to have a voice, and these changes in society are allowing them to have a voice. And the desperation, I think, of Emily Davison is a really interesting piece of that. We also see these different nationalist movements going on around the world. Remember, we talked about in the Victorian period, just before this, the British Empire was at its height. It was enormous, right? So the sun never sets on the British Empire. But over the course of the 20th century, that pretty much disappears. So all of these different colonies around the globe start to want their own independence. So we see these nationalist movements in places like India and Australia and New Zealand and these African countries and Caribbean countries. And so they want to have their own independence. They want to have their own voice. They don't want to be controlled by some different country across the world. So we see that shifting as well. So this thing as the Great British Empire really doesn't exist by the end of the 20th century. One of the key places that we see this happen is in Ireland. Ireland is really close to England, right? They're side by side. Ireland had been ruled by England for hundreds of years. And it had always been a really unsteady relationship. There had been periodic revolutions and rebellions against England, but England had always managed to kind of squash them. During the early part of the 20th century, while World War I is going on, so while England is very much preoccupied with World War I, there is this nationalist movement that grows in Ireland. And in 1916, on the Monday after Easter, begins the Easter Uprising. And there's this long period of incredible violence. The leaders of the Easter Rising were arrested by England and put to death. And all of Ireland kind of comes together and goes, wait a second, that's a little extreme. And so even those who did not support the nationalist movement to start with, they begin to support it after England cracks down so heavily and executes the leaders of the Easter Rising. We will see in the poetry of Yeats a poem called Easter 1916. The uprising itself, and then through the rest of the 20th century, really sees this incredible renaissance of Irish literature. We get to hear Irish voices in a way that we hadn't before. We had Oscar Wilde in the Victorian period, but here with Yeats, and then with James Joyce, and then we see it just snowball until we are, it's easy to find these quality Irish writers thanks to a lot of the movement in the 20th century. So keep that in mind. Ireland gains its independence. The southern part of Ireland gains its independence in 1922, thanks to the rising that began in 1916. Keep that in mind. So here's a map. You can see the counties up at the top are still Northern Ireland. That's still connected to England, or as part of the United Kingdom or Great Britain. Ireland, the southern part there in sort of that tan color, that's its own country. So that's the Republic of Ireland. This idea about Ireland being unified or Ireland ruling itself, so home rule, never really goes away. And we see this turn into great amounts of violence starting in the 1960s and going all the way up to 1998. So for over 30 years, there is incredible violence in Northern Ireland, but it trickles over into all of Ireland. But it's mostly in Northern Ireland, and that period is known as the Troubles. We're going to come back around to that here in just a moment. So some of the other changes in Britain are these global changes. So the global Great Depression of the 1930s, the Spanish Civil War of the late 1930s really encouraged a lot of leftist movements, a lot of communist movements, and versus fascism, which is a right side of the political spectrum movement. And then, of course, World War II, right in the middle of the 20th century in the 1940s. This disappointment that World War I was not the war to end all wars. So these enormous global changes are happening as well. So you can see why the literature of the time period is dark. It's questioning. It's not quite sure of truth anymore. So as the empire shrinks and as colonies begin to get their independence, as society begins to change and even lower classes have chances and have mobility, we start to see new literature. So we start to see literature from the colonies. We get to see African literature and Indian literature and literature from the Caribbean. There are fantastic poets and novelists that now have a voice because they're no longer colonies of England. The same thing's happening in England itself with lower classes. We start to see literature written in dialects or written in accents or written in sort of regional speech, not, proper Oxford kind of English. So in Ireland in the 1960s through the 1990s, we have this period known as the Troubles. There's a fantastic series on Netflix right now called Dairy Girls, it's ridiculously hilarious. I really love it because these girls are in high school in the 1990s, and that's when I was in high school, so the music is my music. Like, it's just really fun. But the Troubles are going on during that time period in Derry. Derry is a town in Northern Ireland, and they play an important kind of backdrop to that TV show. I really recommend it. It's a lot of fun. Short little episodes. They're only 30 minutes long, so it's really super easy to watch. But in Northern Ireland, you get this division between the Catholics who want to stay connected and have a united Ireland, so they don't want to be connected to England anymore. And then you've got the Protestants who are loyal to England, so they are loyalists. It's impossible to divide the religion and the politics, but the violence was so extreme, and it was kind of guerrilla warfare. The IRA, the Irish Republican Army, starts this sort of guerrilla campaign with car bombs and assassins and this kind of urban warfare that killed thousands over the course of the Troubles. In 1998, the Troubles officially come to an end with the Good Friday Agreement. Although there were still some car bombs and things that happened after that, there were some pretty serious peace movements, though, that really helped lead to the Good Friday Agreement. It's still in place. It's still technically a peaceful country. You can travel there. It's fantastic. I love Belfast. It's the capital of Northern Ireland, and there are all kinds of fantastic things in Northern Ireland. But it's tense. You know, there are still some real serious questions between Protestants and Catholics, and it's going to be interesting to see where that goes. So Derry, speaking of Derry, Derry is the site of an attack from British paratroopers on a group of peaceful protesters in 1972, known as Bloody Sunday. And when we get to U2 and we look at their lyrics, they have a song, which you may be familiar with, called Sunday, Bloody Sunday. And it's rooted in that event. That's really what they're talking about. U2 is Irish. They're not from Northern Ireland. They're from around Dublin. But they were affected by the Troubles. There was a car bomb in Dublin that Bono, the leader of U2, witnessed. So there's this moment in 1972 in Derry that is kind of a touchstone moment, because a majority of the young Irish people who were killed were quite young, teenagers, early 20s. Not all of them were, but the vast majority of them were. And so there's this kind of cultural memory around that violence, and we see it in the literature, we see it in the music that comes out of the 20th century in Ireland. All right, so let's look at what we are actually going to read for the 20th century. So in the poetry of the time, we start to see some really interesting shifts where verse and rhyme and rhythm aren't really going to matter that much anymore. The early part of the 20th century, we still had quite a bit of structure in poetry. By the end of the 20th century, that structure is completely optional. And Yeats is a fantastic example of a poet who does all of the above. He has some early poetry that is highly structured. He has some late poetry that is highly modern. So it's much more complex, much more free form. He's a great example of 20th century poetry because you can trace the change even in his own personal poetry. The tone of the poetry shifts too. It is sometimes ironic, sometimes very sarcastic. It deals with some progressive ideas. It pushes the limits on a lot of things, much like the surrealistic art of the time was pushing limits. And then there is, on the other side of that, some poetry that is hyper-realistic, and maybe even talks about some things that are very, very real that poetry maybe never would have wanted to talk about before. We do see a brief moment in the 1950s where some sense of realism and neutralism kind of comes back into play, and there becomes sort of this civil moment in poetry and literature. But then the 1960s hit, and revolution is kind of the name of the game in the 1960s. And everything that we know about revolution here in the United States in the 1960s, where there's like the sexual revolution and women's rights and civil rights for African Americans, all of that same motion is happening in England as well. So popular poetry, popular music, this is when we start seeing the rise of rock and roll, the rise of popular music, and it mirrors the rise in technology of being able to purchase music very quickly on records. So we see these pieces of literature start breaking down a lot of the divisions, right? So there's a lot of diversity between the 60s and the 80s. We get voices of women and of blacks and of those from the colonies, those from poor families, right? So literature and music is no longer the sole possession of the upper class. The fiction that we're going to look at can pretty easily divide into three main sub-periods. We're not going to be reading any of the novels, but one of the interesting things to pay attention to is the idea that even reality is under attack. And we can see that in the novels of James Joyce. Now, the short story you're going to read by James Joyce is pretty straightforward, but some of his novels are stream of consciousness, and his writing is notoriously difficult to understand. If you ever want a sampling of that, just take a look at his novel called Ulysses, and it just simply follows the thoughts of one guy in one day, and it is incredibly hard to understand. So reality itself is questioned in the writing of the time. Much of what is being asked is also disconcerting. So a lot of the literature of the time is asking about connection and is asking about relationship. There is a profound loneliness in the fiction that we will read. The two short stories next week especially. But you see it too in the music. You see it in the music lyrics of the Beatles and of U2. This questioning of relationship, this questioning of loneliness. And we get kind of sucked into some of that darkness of the time. I'm just going to blast through this because it doesn't really apply to what we're going to talk about. All right, so here are the authors we're going to read. First, Yeats. He's born in Dublin, Ireland. He is part of that 20th century renaissance of Irish literature. At first, he really didn't support the movement for Ireland to be its own republic and separate from England, but that did indeed change. He certainly then became part of the movement itself. He is a great example of how literature changes over the 20th century because his poetry changes. You can see his early poetry versus his late poetry, and they're very, very different, almost as though they were written by two different authors. Auden writes more towards the middle of the 20th century. So we see a lot of his poetry be highly political. We see it also kind of later in his life to be incredibly personal. And it does take this tone of loneliness, of asking for a relationship, of wondering about connection between humans, and whether or not we can ever truly know someone. So there's a really deeply personal fear and loneliness that comes out in his later poetry. We're going to read a short story by Catherine Mansfield. She was born in New Zealand, but it was a colony of England at the time, so she is considered a British author, and she did live in England later in her life. Her stories are interesting. They're all about family and friend relationships and just how complex they can get. The story you'll be reading of hers is a short story which she was just incredibly good at, and it's looking at a young girl from a very rich family who is suddenly confronted with real life. And what she does with that is the kind of the structure of the story itself. Then we'll also read a short story by James Joyce called Arabi. His particular This particular short story is also about a young person. This time it's a young boy, and Catherine Mansfield, it's a young girl. And this is a young boy also wrestling with this idea of relationship. He's got a crush on a girl. He wants to go get her a gift. And we get to follow along and be disillusioned with him along the way. It's something that I think every single one of us can identify with. So his and Catherine Mansfield's fiction are both very much about relationship, connection, and loneliness. All right, so that's what we're going to be looking at this week. I look forward to looking at this literature with you.